Hi, this is a presentation on single case research design methodology. I want to start with basics of single case research design. It is the repeated measure of individual participants throughout the study. So instead of having a group and comparing averages of a control group to a intervention group, we take repeated measurement of a student throughout the whole process. So the individual participant serves as his or her own control. So there's a condition of no treatment, and that's compared to the measurement during the treatment. We measure performance before, during, and after the intervention to look for maintenance. But the best thing is that it allows us to depict the process of change as well as what the end performance is. So we can see how quickly and efficiently, effectively and efficiently, behavior changes. So with that, we can build credibility of findings. We want to make sure everything about the context, except that individual independent variable, is held constant over the course of the study, eliminating all other variables, especially those that will confound the results. And lastly, the design requires repeated demonstration, replication of the effects, that the manipulation of the independent variable is associated with the predicted change of the dependent variable. So now, let's talk about dependent variables. Dependent variables are operationally defined to allow for valid and consistent assessment of a variable. We want replication of the assessment process. We need direct observation and empirical summary. For example, words read correctly per minute. That's a common measurement for reading fluency. Frequency of head hits per minute. Not frequency of helping behaviors or aggressive behaviors. We need to have a way to consistently assess behavior across ourselves over time and across other people. So my idea of helping behaviors might be different from another person. Dependent variables are operationally defined. So let's look, for example, with engaged in math. We can operationally define it, making it both observable and measurable by defining it as both hands on the desk, e.g. hand on laptop computer or in the process of writing, face oriented toward the computer or paper, quiet mouth and hands. So now I want you to look at a picture, and I want you to determine, based on this definition, if you think the child or the student is engaged in math. So is he engaged in math? Let's look back. Both hands on the desk or the computer? Oh yes, he is. Face oriented toward the computer or the paper? No, I think he's checking out the lovely lady next to him. And lastly, of course, is he engaged in math? I would say he did not meet the definition. Okay, so we want to define what to measure. Let's look at some of these. Remember, it needs to be objective. It needs to be observable and can be recorded reliably. It needs to be clear, unambiguous, and doesn't take too much explanation, and it has to be complete. So we need clear inclusion and exclusion criteria. So the first one says, the target behavior. Anna is not prepared when class begins. Is that observable and measurable? Her replacement behavior would be, Anna will be prepared when she comes into class. So can we see being prepared, and would one person see the same expect the same behavior to be prepared as the next? So the answer to that is no. So the next two definitions are much more observable and measurable. Let's take a look. Anna waits until after the bell rings to place her pencil and notebook on her desk. So it's very clear and complete, and it can be measured. The replacement behaviors, Anna will have her pencil and notebook on her desk when the bell rings. So dependent variables are measured repeatedly to allow for identification of patterns of performance and a comparison of those patterns across conditions before the intervention, which is baseline, during the intervention, and then after the intervention, maintenance. We are looking at the level of the data, the trend of the data, and the variability. Level, is it high or low? The trend, is it accelerating or decelerating? And then the variability, is it stable or is it all over the place? So we can look at this graphic here to see prior to intervention, we have low level, no trend, stable data. And then once the intervention, we have immediate, abrupt change in level. Still not trending, a little variability, but overall fairly stable. Dependent variable recording is assessed for consistency through what we call inter-observer agreement. Inter-observer agreement, or IOA. The percentage of observation units in which the independent observer agrees. So a second independent observer collects data alongside another observer, and they look for agreement once data collection is complete. This needs to be measured across each condition, each participant in the study, and each variable agreement. If we don't have agreement for the reliability of the recording, we need to strengthen our definition or our data collection methods. Lastly, dependent variables are selected for their social significance. We've learned about social validity, so let's see how this plays in. So, not just because it allows for evaluation of a conceptual theory, we need to make sure that this change in behavior, whether it be academic or social, that it's perceived as important to the individual or for society. This is an example of an older type of conceptual theory or a study that perhaps has over time become less socially acceptable. We now focus on positive reinforcement and positive behavior interventions to help students learn appropriate behaviors. Okay, so how do we define what to measure? Let's review. It needs to be objective. It needs to be observable and can be recorded reliably. And by reliably, I mean with inter-observer agreement or having an independent observer compare data. It needs to be clear. An unambiguous definition doesn't need too much explanation. And lastly, it needs to be complete. Clear inclusion and exclusion criteria will make this happen. At times, the general behavior of concern may be difficult or even impossible to actually observe. The behavior may be related to some internal cognitive process, which of course cannot be directly observed. The dependent variable or the target behavior must be some outcome that reflects the occurrence of the more general behavior. So for example, a social worker may be interested in helping a client cope with stressful marital situation by having him think before he acts. Sound familiar? The overall goal may be for the client to reflect on possible actions to be taken before actually taking action to be successful in a stressful situation. For example, the behavior of concern is reflection on one's own actions. However, this reflection cannot be directly observed. It must be operationally defined so that it can be observed and measured. One way might be to identify the time that elapses between the onset of the stressful situation and the beginning of the action as the dependent variable. So in this case, it would be waiting time. So that's how the target behavior could be observed and recorded. Also, the researcher might measure the accuracy of the individual's ability to verbally recite a series of internal steps that follow the indicated reflection. The researcher might even measure the outcome of the reflection, such as responding in a non-threatening manner after the stressful event occurs. So in each of these cases, the researcher identifies a target behavior that's observable and measurable and is indicative of the overall goal of being achieved. In this case, being reflective. So these direct quantitative measurement techniques are those employed in single case design. So let's look at another definition. Here we have, you have defined head hitting as any time that contact occurs between the palm of Kirby's hand and any part of the head or face. However, would the following action fall within your definition or not? Kirby hits head with closed fist. That would be head hitting, but according to the definition, it has to be contact of the palm of the head and Kirby's head. Kirby hits the ear. Is that? Well, the ear is part of the head or face, I think. Kirby grabs onto hair. That's not head hitting. He's not touching. It depends on if he grabs hair like this or if he grabs hair like this. It seems like this equally problematic either way. Kirby picks his nose. Well, he might have contact of the palm of his face to his palm of his hand to his face, so picking his nose might be considered head hitting. And then Kirby rubs his eyes with the heels of his hand. Is that head hitting? So we need to really refine our definitions to make sure they are complete with inclusion and exclusion criteria. You need to know what exactly do you mean by head. Okay, so how do we define something like cursing? You could say, student utters a word or phrase audible to the observer that is on the list below. Okay, please forgive any offensive language here. While this list could go on forever, the list contains the offensive words used for the particular student. Say, Fran. If Fran starts to use other words found to be offensive by the teacher, the list could be modified. Secondly, you could define cursing as counting the number of times the teacher says to the student, stop cursing, or other utterances to convey the same meaning. And that way, since it's kind of subjective whether someone considers a word offensive, you could measure how many times the teacher found the language to be offensive. So we have two options here. All right, spitting. There is no one definition for spitting. Also, the way your student spits may be more of a drool. What's important is not the name of the behavior, but rather that it is described so well and so precisely that others will know what you are looking for and could record the occurrences the same way you would. The student propels saliva beyond his or her lips. Each attempt to propel saliva is counted as one occurrence. Rocking. The student moves from an upright seated position to at least 20 degrees forward and returns to an upright position. Well, that's pretty specific. You would need inter-observer agreement to see if you both could judge. Is it easily judged of 20 degrees of an angle of a body? That's why inter-observer agreement is important, because then you can look at the comparison of the data to see, is this defined in a way that is usable and reliably recorded. Okay, so how do we measure these defined behaviors? That's coming next. Stay tuned.